Hello and welcome back to another video. Yes, I know that there are no shelves behind me. It's in progress, so stop bugging me about it because I have a hammer. I hope you all had a wonderful ACE week, and now we're back into normal videos. The one I wanted to start with was talking about the intersection between asexuality and gender. And to do this, I actually spoke to someone a few weeks ago. I'll let him introduce himself because there's a lot of information that I'm sure he can say much more fluently than I can.
My name is Canton Weiner. I'm a sociology PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine. And I study the intersection of gender and sexuality in a bunch of different ways, but I'm specifically interested in the ways that we can study that intersection through asexual experiences and perspectives, and what that can shine light on even for people who are not asexual.
I first encountered Canton at the International Asexuality Conference earlier this year, and what really interested me about his research was the intersection specifically between masculinity and asexuality, and how that may affect the proportion of men that identify as asexual, because this is something that I have come across in statistics and when I'm doing interviews with the media. But the first thing that I asked was why research asexuality in particular?
And I think often when you want to learn about the way that power dynamics work, the best way to do that is to talk to people who kind of exist at the margins of those power systems. Asexuality stood out to me as like, wow, this is a group of people I can talk to who have this expertise that I'm looking for.
One thing that's really interested me is the small proportion of men who identify as asexual. One figure that Canton gives is
about, I think, 60% of ace individuals identify as women, 30% as neither men nor women, and then only about 10% as men.
As I mentioned earlier, this is something that I myself have noticed, and I get a lot of comments in my videos of people who are happy to see male ace representation because there is much less of it. So I asked Canton if he has any theories about why that may be, why there may be a smaller proportion of men who identify as asexual.
The types of gendered pressures that you face are really different for men and for women. So for traditional kind of normative masculinity, performing sexuality, and especially performing heterosexuality, is such a key way of proving that you're a man, basically. And so I think that similar pressure doesn't really exist for women in quite the same way.
This pretty much lined up with what I expected, that men are expected by society to be more outwardly and inherently sexual, even though that's not necessarily the case, whereas women's sexualities tends to be ignored or suppressed. On the topic of erasure, Canton noticed that there are different ways in which asexuality is erased, and that erasure may depend on the person's gender.
Erasure, asexual erasure, is this very common experience in the ace community, as I'm sure will be surprising to very few people listening to this. But that looks really different depending on what your gender identity is. And so in the end, asexuality is erased for both groups, but for men, it's because asexuality is seen as impossible, and for women, it's seen as unremarkable.
But of course, there aren't only two genders, and another thing that was explored was the non-binary identities. One thing that I found really interesting was that in this study, 30% of the respondents identified as non-binary versus 10% who identified as male. That's 3 times the amount of people who were non-binary to men. If you compare this to statistics of the general population, you would normally get something like 50-50 of male and female, and the remaining few percent being non-binary.
People who are non-binary are more likely to become aware of and to embrace asexuality. I think when you're already existing outside of the cis-normative, heteronormative system that we live in, it's less pressure to kind of add on additional things that mark you as being outside of those binaries.
And I agree that being in the queer community helps you then identify with other queer identities and experiences. Canton even implied that asexuality may allow for more expression of gender because it exists outside the gender binary.
Asexuality is different from especially homosexuality and heterosexuality, where you kind of have to make an inherent assumption about even your own gender identity in order to occupy those sexual identities. But asexuality doesn't have that same assumption. And so it allows a little bit more room, I think, for gender exploration than some of our other sexual identity labels do.
In addition to this, outside of explicitly non-binary identities, Canton noticed that some people didn't like to be described by gendered terms at all.
And so what I've kind of discovered as I've spoken with more people and tried to figure this out is that there's, at least among the ace people who I've spoken with, a significant number of them, disproportionately people who are assigned female at birth, who basically don't like to be understood through gendered terms whatsoever. So they're like, yeah, I'm not trans, I'm not exactly non-binary, I don't feel like I have an inherent gender identity, and I don't want to be understood through the lens of gender.
Originally, I questioned whether this was an agender identity, but he clarified that it was distinct from this.
Where the people who I'm speaking about specifically aren't even adopting an agender identity. They're saying like, no, I really don't want to be understood through any lens of gender, including agender.
Once we'd rounded out our discussion about gender, I thought it was interesting to ask whether there are any other intersectional identities which may affect your experience of being asexual and maybe affect the proportion of people within those intersectional identities who identify as asexual.
One that stands out to me as being particularly important for the asexual community to discuss is race. Race is such an important building block of modern society, and it really shapes your life experiences in so many ways. And so, of course, that would shape our experience of sexuality as well.
Race is obviously incredibly important to talk about, and Canton mentioned that ace spaces can often be implicitly white dominated.
That first of all, race doesn't come up as a topic of discussion much. But when it does, it's usually raised by someone who self-identifies as a person of color, and not 100% of the time, but very frequently, they receive responses that are negative to what they're saying. And of course, that's a problem, right? Because it reinforces kind of a feeling of unwelcoming to people of color within the asexual community. But the result often of spaces that are race neutral is actually just that they're implicitly white and white dominated.
I personally think that it is really important that aces of colour are given the space and the respect to talk about their stories and share their experiences. However, it is also an important discussion for white aces to be involved in. The responsibility of solving racism within the ace community shouldn't be laying solely upon the people who are victim to it.
But I think this is something that everyone in the community needs to put effort into learning about, right? And especially white people, in order to make the community more accessible to others.
I really enjoyed the conversation I had with Canton, and I hope you enjoyed this little look at it as well. If you're interested in listening to the whole conversation, then I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. I'm hoping that I'll be able to explore the intersection between asexuality, race, and gender in the future. The main topic of Canton's research isn't focused on race, but he did suggest a few other researchers who do talk more in depth about the intersection between asexuality and race. These being Iana Hawkins-Owen, Atia McGee, and Brittany Miles. And of course, at the end of the video, I completely forgot to ask him what his favourite cake was, but I just messaged him and got the response. His favourite cake is orange dreamsicle cake, which is not something I have heard of before, but it sounds incredibly sweet, is what I'm going to say. I've had some really nice orange cakes though, so I'm sure it's delicious. If you're interested in following Canton, then...
If people are interested in joining me on Twitter, you can find me. It's just my name, Canton Weiner. I really enjoy interacting with people on Twitter because I learn so much from folks there. So please feel free to follow me there.
That is all I had to say for today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and do tell me what you think about this different style of interview. Obviously, if you do just want to listen to the whole interview, like I said, it's in the description below. But I thought it would be nice to have it in a more concise format. After all, I'm not the best person at asking questions, so I didn't think it was very engaging content for me to be stumbling over my words for half an hour. But if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I had to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time. I don't know why I'm just swinging this hammer around. It's like when I had that knife. There's a bunch of people in the comments going to be complaining about me swinging a hammer around. Like I'm going to whack it into the wall and there's going to be a hole in my wall. Like, it's my wall. Why do you care?